In this lesson, we're talking a little bit about architectural patterns, but really specifically, we're talking about the model view controller design pattern or architectural pattern. There's a lot of different patterns out there, and remember, patterns, they aren't really invented. It's more like they are discovered. So over time, as software is developed, then there's kind of this discovery of what works really well for certain situations, and that's where we start to pick up on patterns. So just like in physical buildings that are built and constructed, there's patterns and styles that come out of those buildings. And so similarly, we have software that develops patterns. So this pattern that we're talking about for this exercise is MVC. And let me go ahead and walk you through a little bit more about that. So this is going to be an exercise called MVC calculator. We're going to use some code that's already in existence for us. That's a calculator. And we're going to make some modifications. So what is MVC? This is a pattern that's used to separate an application into three different parts. There's the model, which handles the data, the view, which is what the user sees and interacts with, and the controller, which handles the different business logic and event actions. So those are the three different parts, and the separation helps us with a few different things. It gives us some organization, and organization is very important, especially as you work with a team, because if your code is organized, it's easier for others to be able to read through it, understand what's happening, and then be able to make changes on it for either bug fixes or to modify it or extend it. It also improves our maintainability, and that's important for the lifespan of your software. As time goes on, there's going to be hardware updates and technology updates and things like that we need to be able to maintain and keep things running, continue to fix bugs, and then also modify them down the road, because users are going to want more features, and technology is going to allow us to have more features or different things that we couldn't have necessarily imagined before. And we want to be able to modify and change. That allows us to evolve our software. And the more modular we are, so this also promotes the concept of modularization, that separation of different sections, just like we're separating out the model, separating out the view, separating out the control. That modularization means that we can make changes to one area and not have to touch a whole lot, which you'll see in this exercise. We won't even touch the model for this exercise. We'll do very little for the view, because we're only going to add one button, and we'll do quite a bit in the controller because we're going to add functionality to allow the user to use the keyboard in addition to the buttons. So you'll be able to see how that modularization works and how that really simplifies your ability to make changes. So let's first kind of go through a little bit more about what each of these are. So starting with a model, this represents the data and to some extent the business logic. It's going to manage your data, process your business rules, and it's going to respond to the requests that the view is going to make about the application state. What it does is it's going to notify any registered observers, that's usually going to be your views, about any changes in the state, any changes in the data. And that allows those observers to update accordingly. So the views, in this case, when it finds out that the model has changed, the view can update and show the new data. In well-designed MVC apps, the model should be independent of both the view and the controller. They should all be separate. And that allows for more reusability and more testability. When you have things broken down and modular, it becomes more testable because you don't have to worry about things that are intertwined nearly as much, and it's simpler to test things that are independent of other parts. The view is the part that the user sees. This is, in the case of our exercise, this is the actual calculator. This is the interface. These are the buttons they click. This is what the user gets to interact with. And this is going to present the data that it gets from the model. And then when the model gets updates, then the view will want to update. When the view receives input from the user, like button clicks and keyboard input, then the controller is going to get those events from the view. The view is going to say, hey, user just did something on my view. Let me send that to the controller. Controller, you handle it. Okay? So these views are really passive. They just pass things along. They don't really contain business logic. They just provide data from the model and pass along any events to the controller. Multiple views can be associated to a single model. So you can have your single model, your single bit of data, and have different views. So for example, we're doing a calculator example. We have a very simple model. You could have different calculator views that just change the style of how it looks. You could have one model that's used in both a scientific calculator and a simplified calculator, or in maybe a different example, you could have application information in a model that has a very simplified view for a user with limited responsibility and ability, and maybe a different view for an administrative user that can see much more than a normal user. Okay, so that's a nice thing about views and models, is that one model could be used for multiple views. All right, the controller. So remember, in our view, we can receive events from the user. In the case of our example that we're going to dive into, that could be button clicks or keyboard clicks. The view passes that to the controller, and the controller is going to act as an intermediary between the model and the view. So it takes that user input, and then it will update the model, most likely, depending on what's going on, and then update the view based on whatever happens in the model. So with the model update, we'll get the new model data and the view updates. So the controller is responsible for interpreting the user actions and then invokes the appropriate methods on the model to update the state. And again, in a well-designed MVC architecture, controllers are decoupled. Remember, in an earlier lesson we talked about coupling. It's decoupled from the views. It's separated out. And again, this is good for reusability and testability. That modularity is really helpful down the road. This is a very simple app, but if you can keep complicated apps simple by keeping them modular, that's very helpful. All right, now that we understand the MVC parts, let's understand a little bit about that flow. Let's just walk through it just to make sure that all makes sense, how it's working together. So the user gets to interact with the view, and their interaction is usually providing some sort of input, either button clicks, keyboard clicks, whatever, some sort of input. The view then forwards that input to the controller. The controller then processes that input and most likely updates the model, just depends on what needs to happen based on that input. The model then notifies any views that are registered or subscribed to that model. It notifies those views about any changes. The views get the updated data from the model and then refresh so that they're showing the new information. And then the user sees that new updated view, and then they can continue to interact with the application. So it kind of works in a big circle of user interaction, and then controller updating the model pushing that information to the view, and the user can continue to do what they're doing. This pattern, again, is good to achieve that separation of concerns. So it separates out those three different sections of the model: the data, the view, what the user sees, and the controller, the actions that happen with the event. That makes it easy to modify or extend one component without having to affect all the others. If you remember when we talked about quality attributes, we also talked about with the modifiability and changeability, we looked at Git commits and how many files were touched in those commits. If you only touched one file, then that implies that you only had to touch really one component and not a lot of others. That makes it very modifiable. If you have to touch a lot of files, you're potentially touching a lot of components and it's not separated out. It's more difficult to make changes. So that's where the separation of concerns is really helpful. This is also something that's this pattern, MVC, is common in a lot of areas. You'll see it show up in a lot of places. Ruby on Rails, Django, desktop apps, it's all over the place. So this is a good, simple way to understand the flow of that. So in this exercise, what we're going to do is we have a GUI-based Python calculator. GUI is graphic user interface. And it's just one file, main.py. You can click on it right there and download it. This is the code we'll be going through in just a moment. You can click on this download raw file, and that will download main.py, and then you can open that in your favorite Python editor. I use the PyCharm Community Edition. That's what you'll see me working in. I find that's just a nice simple application that helps make it easy to get everything you need. So download that, then study that to understand the structure. I'll go through it in a minute. And then you're going to make a couple of changes. The first one is we're going to add a button so that the user can add decimal points. Right now, the calculator that I'll show you can only handle integers. You can't do decimal numbers. And also, the calculator only supports clicking on the buttons with your mouse. You can't type in the keyboard. And you're going to make it so that you can type in the keyboard. And then you're also going to make sure that the keyboard and mouse entry, which is just clicking the buttons, either of those should be able to work. All right, let's dive into the code. So this is main.py. I've already downloaded it. And this is going to use a dependency called tkinter. And this allows us to make that GUI interface and use a grid to assign spots for each of the items that we're putting in. So first up, we've got the model class. So we have a class for each of our sections. We have model, view, and controller. And again, this is our data. So you won't have to touch this at all for this exercise. The model doesn't need to change. It's already set up with everything it needs to be able to do calculations and to clear the keyboard or clear the calculator and store a value. All right? So look at that model, understand it, but you won't have to make any changes here. Then in the view, we have a few different things that are happening. This is, again, what the user is seeing. Let me go ahead and run it, and you can see my calculator here. And you can also see, if I scroll all the way down here to my main function, this is what's going to run and instantiate my model, view, and controller. But I've imported sys right here just for the purpose of outputting the Python version that you're running. That way you can see what I'm running, and then you can also cross-check what you're running when you run this. And if you're having any trouble, consider updating. Some of the older versions of Python might be a little bit more finicky working with this, but that's just something for you to reference if you need it. Okay, back up to the view. So first we're adding the calculator display, and that's adding what's called a label. That is adding this right here, this 0 right now, but if I were to add different things in here, this is all part of the label. This is my calculator display. So that's what this is doing here, is just adding this label here, this display. Then we have another method that adds the numbers keypad. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. You can see here 1, 2, 3, and you can see that it's adding the button to the frame, and it's giving it some text, so it's labeling those buttons. and then it's giving it a position on the grid. So row 1, column 0. So you can see exactly how those are added. That goes through all the numbers, gets them in the display. And then we have one more method for the operations keypad. That's our plus, asterisk, minus, and slash. And you can see that, and also the clear and equal. These two down here, so I can hit clear. Those are all added in this method here, operations keypad. This is where you would want to add one more button addition for the decimal key. So you would give it its own name. So this is div for divide, mul for multiply. Basically just copy exactly what's done in these two lines here and input the correct text label and put it in a different spot on the grid so that it shows up. And that's all you have to do. You just have to add it to the view. Okay, now remember, once you add it to the view, you need the controller to know what to do with it if the user clicks on it. So let's continue. Well, first, here's the view again. This initiates it, instantiates it, and this is where those three methods are called: add calculator display, add number key, add operation key. Okay, and then we can skip past that, but you can take a closer look because that refresh you may end up using later. Down to the controller here. Remember, this is where we figure out what needs to happen when the user actually clicks on something in the view or types something. So this is what handles the event. So first, we've got we've defined our model and view here. Now we've got our number pad events. So these are those variable names that we gave them in the view. And then you don't need to understand quite all of this, but we've got an event, we've got which number, and then we're calling something called the number pad callback, which we'll get to just a little bit further down on the page. And then we've got a similar set for operator pad button events. So you would add one more line right under here for what happens with the decimal. And you should be able to follow this same pattern to get that working, and it should just work for you. So at that point, you should have a calculator that now has one more button. And I will actually show you an example here. It would look something like this wherever you decide to place it, so that a user could potentially use that decimal key and run equations. So that's what it would look like. Okay, something like that once you've got it working. And then we've also got events for our clear and our equal. And then we have one down here for the keystroke callbacks, which we will add in here. Okay, that we'll come back to that in just a second. But remember how I said this is doing the operation pad callback and the number pad callback? That's what's happening here. So we're taking the model and handling the event with whatever the new value is. And then we're refreshing the view with that updated model value. Okay, and then I'm also printing in a number of places what's going on, just to help make it easier to see what buttons have been clicked and how things are going. All right, now back to our controller's handling of the keyboard. What we need to do is we're going to add to our keystroke callback. So we don't need to really add anything up here. All of these operators are being handled, but we want to be able to type into our keyboard. So let's go ahead and pop this up again. Right now I can do 3 + 2 = by clicking buttons. But what if I want to type other numbers? You can see in my print output that it's seeing those. It's seeing the different things that I'm typing, but it's not showing up here in my view. And it's not doing anything. It's not updating my model values. So what you would need to do is in this keystroke callback, we want to start handling that. So I'll get you started here with an example. you're going to add something like a conditional. So you're going to look at the events, and we're going to look at the key sim, which that's whatever comes in through the keys. And I'm going to give you that this is what it's going to look like to handle the numbers, okay? You're going to then follow the same pattern. Let's actually just scroll down here. You're going to follow this pattern here, self.model.event, but instead of this number, we're going to say whatever key sim is from the event, okay? That key symbol. So now, if I rerun this, all right, now I can be typing my keys, and it's getting those keystrokes, and my model is updating, but you'll see my view isn't, and that's because we need to also remember to refresh the view with a new model value. All right, so let's do that one more time. Okay, now you can see as I type, my view is updating. Perfect. So now we've got, at the very least, our numbers are happening here. Now, what if it's something else? What if I want to hit minus, or if I want to hit plus? So obviously I'm just typing it in here because I'm not running it now, but if you noticed in here, when those keystrokes were going, earlier you're seeing the output for it. Let's go ahead and show what that might look like as another conditional. Let's do minus. So what you would do in this case, the event key sim, that key symbol, that would just be the word minus, and we can't use that in an equation. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell it which value we want to run in the event. So something like this. And then we're also going to remember to update our view. Now this is repetitive. You see how I've used the exact same thing twice? So what I can do, instead of having that in two places, what would be better is to just go ahead and sort out my model updates. And then once I'm done with that conditional, I can then go ahead and refresh it. That way I don't have to paste it multiple times. We also might want to consider adding one more catch statement at the very end for anything that we don't capture in these earlier conditionals, just so we can see what it is and see that that's something that we're trying to do. Let's go ahead and run it just to see what happens here. So here's my calculator. So I can still click on buttons. Now I can also do, I'm going to hit the minus key. You can see my keystroke down here is minus, and you can see my view updated. I typed the letter 6. You can see keystroke again. I can hit plus. This is an operation. You can see I did a button. Okay, number 2 is click. That's a button. I'm going to hit equals because I haven't programmed that in the keyboard yet. But you can see that it's sorting all of that out. So what you need to do then is you need to add any more of these operation buttons. So the plus, the asterisk, the divide, the decimal that is in the final version, and then also this equal and clears. You should be able to add all of those in a similar fashion here so that you can do anything that you can do with the buttons using your keyboard. And again, this is going to look something like this in the end, where actually, sorry, that was the main one again. Let me go ahead and run solution. It'll look something like this, where you can, here's my solution output. And then I should be able to do stuff with my calculator on my keyboard. Hit equals. I should be able to do it on the buttons. Hit equals. There we go. I got confused with the 0 in the front, but you should be able to play with it with both the keyboard and the mouse and have a working solution for both the keyboard and the mouse and adding that decimal key in. So again, something like that. I'm hitting the enter key. That was the same as the equal key. So there you go. Hopefully that helps make it a little easier to understand the model, view, and controller and how each of those separate parts works together to manage the information for the application. That's a good way to get some experience too of modifying and extending some of the things that are already there. Thanks for your time.